Welcome to the Modern Law Library. I'm your host, Lee Rawls, and today I'm joined by Richard Thompson Ford, the author of the new book, Dress Codes: How the Laws of Fashion Made History. Richard, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Could you tell my listeners a little bit about who you are and how you came to write this book?
Well, I'm a law professor at Stanford, and I teach, among other things, employment discrimination. I've taught some constitutional law. And one of the surprising things that I found in studying anti-discrimination law is how many disputes involve a dress code of some kind, either an employee who's resisting a dress code, cases involving high school students who are sent home from school for defying a school dress code, and also how strongly people feel about these dress codes. So in the employment discrimination context, what's striking is that you have employees who are willing to risk or even in fact lose good jobs because they don't want to comply with the dress code, and employers who are willing to lose otherwise good employees who won't comply with a workplace dress code. And that always struck me as something that was striking, particularly in a society where we tend to say, we don't care about dress, we're above that, it's superficial. So everyone says who cares, but people are actually making decisions in their day-to-day lives that suggest they care a great deal. And getting interested in that was one of the reasons that I wanted to explore this more in depth, and I got started on this project. There's a personal reason as well, which is my father actually trained as a tailor. He was a university administrator. He's also an ordained minister. He was a community activist, but he trained as a tailor in college at a time when African Americans often learned both a trade as well as a profession in order to kind of backstop against the risk that racism might keep them from their chosen profession. And because he trained as a tailor, he knew a lot about clothing, the way they should be constructed, quality clothing, and thought a lot about self-presentation. And as a child growing up, I noticed the way he took care with his appearance, and he cared about it, even in context where other people might dress very casually. He thought it was important to present a dignified and professional image. And that was a part of his relationship to the world. It was a part of his self-expression, but it was also very clearly a way for him to navigate a difficult terrain with respect to race relations. And, he became a university administrator at a time when there were relatively few African Americans working in higher education, and certainly had to confront some degree of racism and racial resistance.
What I loved about this book was that while you definitely get into the moral, social, and legal implications to various dress codes, what you really do is you go back and you look at what fashion has meant at various parts of history and how it changes and evolves. And so it's also such an interesting history of fashion and the values that we assign to it. I think that probably there isn't a single one of my listeners who hasn't experienced being dressed incorrectly for an occasion. You misjudged, you wore something wrong, and you are extremely conscious of it and about it. And I think it's at those times, particularly, that we notice the power that fashion has. But the coded messages that we put on fashion really change over the ages. And I would love to hear, were there any huge surprises to you as you were researching this when it came to what we wear and why we wear it?
Yes, there were a lot of surprises. As I started to look back in history, the first surprise was how far back in history I felt I had to go in order to get my bearings. So I started off thinking I'd write a book about the late 20th century, and I wound up writing a book that started in the late Middle Ages. One of the reasons for that was that the way fashion evolved and the roots of the way we currently experience the importance of fashion started in the late Middle Ages, when clothing, new techniques in clothing made it much more expressive and gave it the possibility to kind of express individual personality. And so the first big surprise was the way that fashion during this period of time, this early period, it did two things. One, it could express social status. And of course, that's familiar to us today, but it was much more pronounced and much more explicit in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that clothing was designed to express high status. The stereotype is that only the king may wear purple. But in fact, the laws were extremely elaborate, much more elaborate than just the king wearing purple. In some cases, quite specific types of clothing that were restricted according to social rank, with 20 or 30 different social ranks included. So that, but also the resistance to that and the way that individuals used fashion in order not only to try to express a particular social rank, but also to express their own unique individual personality. And it's really the emergence of that sense of individualism and the way fashion contributed to that kind of defines the whole story, in my view, and was one of the big surprises.
To me, I knew about sumptuary laws and, regulations when it came to, oh, like you said, I think that, many listeners probably have heard that, there were these restrictions about, who could wear what. You can't wear a crown if you're not a queen, and that sort of. And in fact, in the book, you mention a couple queens who were quite put out that ladies were wearing headdresses that were essentially just like their own crowns. How
Yes.
terrible. But one thing that I had never heard about and really found fascinating was the Great Masculine Renunciation, which has a tremendous name, and it sounds like the Protestant Reformation, and it seems like that was happening at about the same time. But tell us about the Great Masculine Renunciation and how it led to what men are even today expected to put on before they enter a law office.
Yes. So a psychologist named John Carl Flugel, who wound up being an activist in a men's dress reform movement, wrote in the 1930s about this moment that he describes as the Great Masculine Renunciation. And this occurred in the late 1700s. What's striking is that before the Great Masculine Renunciation, the types of clothing that signified high status did so by being sumptuous, decorated, ostentatious. So you have jewels, you have brocade, you have a great elaborate and in many ways impractical costume. And if you look at portraits from that period of time, you can see it quite clearly. And this was true for men and women. So men, even in some cases, as much or more so than women, would wear this kind of elaborate clothing, ostrich plumes and a hat, and jewels and makeup. And this was what signified high status. Sometime in the late 1700s, this began to shift, and men began to cast off this kind of elaborate and ostentatious display in favor of more practical, streamlined, sober clothing, dark colors, no jewelry, no ornamentation, no makeup. And this was the period of time that he describes as the Great Masculine Renunciation. So in some environments, it was as short as a period of 30 years that you can see the difference between masculine fashion that's very, very elaborate and ornate and masculine fashion that's quite subdued and streamlined. And that new masculine fashion has a symbolic importance. It signifies a rejection of the rituals of court. It signifies a rejection of a particular kind of status hierarchy that's explicit, and the embrace of Enlightenment values, practicality, science, industriousness now suddenly become the most valued traits. And clothing really signifies that, but only for men. And so there's an important gender story here too.
And you do get into quite a bit of discussion about gender and, what we wear and what we across the ages have meant to, what message you mean to send, whether it's, hey, this style of clothing is literally what makes it easy for me to do my job. And you make the point that comfort is usually not actually the biggest decision we make when we choose what clothes to put on. Could you talk a little bit about what we are really considering aside from comfort when it comes to how we choose to dress ourselves, including, what that may say when it comes to gender implications?
Yes. So clothing serves these two functions. It signifies status, a position in society, our social role, and that includes things like gender, but and also is a way of expressing our individual personality. And as time goes on, this idea of expressing individual authenticity, for instance, becomes very important. Now, streamlined, practical clothing begins with an important symbolic resonance. After the great masculine renunciation, it's communicating something. It's not just practical. And in fact, when you look at some of the supposedly practical clothing that evolves, it's actually quite elaborate, but the elaborate parts are hidden. So a men's suit today can be just as elaborate as a haute couture gown, but all of the hard work is concealed on the inside in details of construction, and that makes the suit hang and fit in a particular way. But that's not all about practicality. It's about look, and it's about conveying an image, a modern, streamlined, practical, industrious image. Now, when you get to today's environment, where people who are wearing things that are supposedly practical and comfortable wear hoodies, sweatshirts, t-shirts, or what have you, those are also sending a message. And we can see that when we listen to what they say about it. So let's take Mark Zuckerberg, who's famous for wearing a gray t-shirt. Well, it's not enough for him to just wear the gray t-shirt because it's comfortable, but he also has to say, and he says something like this: the reason I wear a gray t-shirt every day is because if I wasted time thinking about what to wear every morning, I wouldn't be doing my job. So now suddenly he's ascribed moral significance to the gray t-shirts and set up a sort of a dress code. Because what do you think we're going to think of the person who comes in and looks like they did spend a lot of time on their dress when the boss has just said spending a lot of time on your dress means you're not doing your job?
And you do make the point that even though he has set up this uniform for himself, when he is called before Congress, he still wears a suit.
He puts on a suit.
So it's still clear that to him, there are still occasions where, nope, it is much more important to dress in a suit than this gray t-shirt. I think that whenever we at the ABA Journal run articles with fashion tips for attorneys or, do open questions, one of the ones we got some of the most feedback on, and this is years back, was seersucker. And are seersucker suits appropriate for court? And if they are, during what time period? Can it only be the summer months? Is it only in the South? And things like this, people get very invested in. And especially for, I think, newcomers to the profession, these are such areas with hidden trapdoors and pitfalls. What has been your experience, because you were also a practicing attorney at one point in time? You're a young attorney, you're dressing the way you think is professional, and it turns out you've committed some faux pas, some unstated fashion rule came and bit you.
Yes. Well, when I first started practicing as an attorney, I went out and bought a bunch of suits that I thought were very nice. And one of my favorites was a double-breasted suit. It's the most expensive one I bought. So I thought the idea was I look professional in this very nice suit. I came to the office, and the head of the practice group where I just started, says, "Well, that's quite a suit there." So at first I thought, oh, that's a compliment. But he kept saying it every time I wore the suit. "Oh, that's really quite a suit there." And I started to realize that's not exactly a compliment. He's saying that suit's a bit much. And I realized that as I looked around, yeah, this is a suit that's appropriate for a law office, but only the partners are wearing a suit like this. The associates are all wearing something a little bit more, subdued. So I realized that was kind of breaching some sort of a status hierarchy. It was a little bit like the commoner wearing purple. I should save that suit for the weekend and going out on a date, but not wear it to the office anymore. So those kind of subtle cues are important.
And I have to ask, as a law professor, is that something you ever address with your students or coach them on or talk to them about when it comes to, well, I'm sending you out into the world to be hopefully employed attorneys, and here's my best advice for a young lawyer looking to build their first professional wardrobe?
Well, only if they ask me directly, and because that kind of advice is very fraught. One of the things I write about in the book is the way law schools sometimes have these what to wear and what not to wear events, and they tell the law students what they're should wear, but it can be taken the wrong way very easily. Now, it is true that law students sometimes could use a little bit of advice. I could have used a little bit of advice and would have avoided, spending a lot of money on a suit I couldn't wear to work. But there's so much personally invested in it that it's very easy for people to feel insulted if you tell them that what they're wearing is inappropriate. So it's a pretty delicate thing.
Definitely agree with that. And, you bring up in the book, and I think anyone who's been in the world as an adult surely has noticed that there are, cultural and racial issues when it comes to what we wear, what we choose to wear, what we can get away with wearing.
Yes.
I'm a white woman and my hair is slightly wavy, but I have gone to work with my hair still wet from the shower. Didn't even bother blow drying it. Not a problem. And those are standards that I am held to that are not as high as, what some of my colleagues who are Black women may be, or, if not required by an official dress code, required by societal norms to do to their hair or their dress and things that, you can or can't get away with. When you were writing the book, how'd you decide to focus on that or describe that or get into those issues?
Well, this is one of the areas where doing the research for the book actually changed my mind about an issue. In the past, I had thought, dress codes can be problematic, but they're just one of a number of things that you have to do in a workplace environment. In some cases, not the most onerous. And if the employer has a dress code about hair, well, that's not it may be bothersome, but it's not a civil rights issue. But looking at the importance of hair in the racial justice struggle and as a matter of racial pride, and in particular, the fraught relationship with hair and European standards of beauty for African American women really made me change my mind about this view that it is a social justice issue and it is a civil rights issue. And the difficulty in presenting what society considers to be a professional or polished experience in a context in which that is not only comes with gender trapdoors and pitfalls, but with racialized standards of beauty is a serious problem. So those are dress codes that I really think are inappropriate and should be changed.
And I want to tack a little bit, staying with the hair idea, but moving on to barristers' wigs, because that's something that the American legal profession generally doesn't have to worry about at all, but that our colleagues across the pond in either direction, I believe that in Australia too, wigs are a thing. Could you talk a little bit about the phenomenon of barristers' wigs and why don't we wear them and why do other locations and legal professionals still have to wear those?
Yes, it's interesting. So the wig, I've got a whole section in the book about wigs, and the powdered wig, which started out as a symbol of aristocratic opulence, and it's the big kind of Louis XIV style powdered wig. Over time, because it was a status symbol, became something that other people wanted to wear. But an interesting thing happened, which was that as more people from different social classes decided to wear the wig, it got kind of reconfigured from a big elaborate status symbol to something that was more streamlined, more practical. Wig manufacturers actually even started to market them as something that was just a practical, grooming solution. So the relationship between social status and the wig got more complicated. The barrister's wig first started out as just masculine fashion. It was what, men of a particular social status wore. So people wore that to court in the same way that you'd wear a suit to court. It's the appropriate attire. But over time, as the wig kind of fell out of fashion, they got smaller and smaller, and then eventually men stopped wearing them. This was part of the great masculine renunciation that we talked about before. The wigs was seen as a form of vanity that was no longer appropriate for men. They stayed with lawyers as a professional symbol. So they took on a different meaning, a meaning that they were a symbol of a particular old ancient profession. And it was custom for still for lawyers to wear the wig, even though other people in the rest of the society weren't wearing them. Finally, in one case in, I think it was 1844, a lawyer came before a court in England without the wig. And the judge said that he was not seen. And what it meant to say, you are not seen, is you're not dressed appropriately, and I won't pay attention to you. You can't argue in front of the court dressed that way. And that case established the principle that barristers appearing before the court in England needed to wear a wig. And that's stayed ever since and has become, a rule, a dress code.
Well, we may not have the wig as a dress code, but there is a sort of a relic rule that we have for the Solicitor General. But this wasn't something I knew about before I read dress codes. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit about the Solicitor General rule of what you're going to wear. And then, if you wouldn't mind reading a passage from your book where you describe the story of Elena Kagan and the mourning coat.
Yes. So the mourning coat, in a similar fashion, became required attire for the Solicitor General arguing in front of the Supreme Court. But it started off as simply appropriate attire for lawyers, any lawyer arguing in front of the Supreme Court. So that there were earlier instances in which the justices would object if a lawyer came in wearing what were considered to be street clothes. In one case, Justice Horace Gray, when a lawyer came before them wearing not the mourning coat, exclaimed, "Who is that beast who dares to come in here in a gray coat?" and refused to see the lawyer, and he had to go home and change.
He sounds like a real good time.
Yeah, yes. So to some extent, these dress codes still exist today, and it's still tradition for the Solicitor General to wear a mourning coat and its expected attire. But the difficulty comes about because the mourning coat and suit is, of course, a masculine attire. So here's the passage from the book. The sartorial traditions of Anglo-American courts were established during an era when the legal profession was an exclusive boys' club. The mourning coat, the bench wig, and even the judge's black robe were menswear. However affected and costume-like they look when worn by men today, they are even a more awkward fit for women. So, when a young lawyer named Elena Kagan became the first female Solicitor General in 2010, there was widespread concern and consternation surrounding her options for professional attire. Would she wear the mourning coat? A lot was at stake because jurists in the Anglo-American tradition are often unforgiving when it comes to sartorial etiquette, as was demonstrated by the English custom that barristers who fail to wear the bench wig are not seen by the judge, and by Justice Horace Gray's outrage over the effrontery of a lawyer wearing a gray coat. Columbia Law School professor Patricia Williams recounted another example that was even more germane to Kagan's predicament. During the Clinton administration, a female deputy from the Solicitor General's office once eschewed the masculine morning suit and wore a dove brown or dough beige business suit when she appeared before the Supreme Court. Observers reported that Chief Justice William Rehnquist chastised her in open court for her attire and sent an angry letter to the Solicitor General's office in which he demanded that such a breach of decorum not be repeated. In response, the office recommended that its female attorneys appear before Rehnquist in a feminized version of the traditional morning suit. What is a feminized version of the morning suit? Professor Williams speculated that it would be more or less like the men's version, only with darts at the bust line, and instead of the classic striped charcoal trousers, a neoclassical striped charcoal skirt. Open question whether same requires a Windsor knotted tie with stretched winged collar. Slate's legal commentator Dahlia Lithwick tackled the larger dilemma confronting Solicitor General Kagan, noting that in historical terms, the female equivalent of the mourning coat is either an off-the-shoulder ball gown or a mother-of-the-bride pastel confection. The problem for Kagan was that the mourning suit became professional attire because it was formal masculine attire of its era. It symbolized the virtues of sober judgment and industriousness that inspired the great masculine renunciation. And an indispensable part of that symbolism of masculine attire lies in its contrast with its opposite, feminine attire, which came to symbolize much of what the masculine renunciation renounced: ornamentation, display, fantasy, and vanity surrounding the physical body. The mourning suit itself is unmistakably masculine, and as a consequence, any woman who adopts it will unavoidably come off as if dressed in provocative drag, like Marlene Dietrich in the film Morocco. The symbolism of the mourning suit is unmistakably masculine by design. There can be no feminine equivalent. As Lithwick points out, the feminine formal wear of the contemporaneous era is the symbolic opposite of the suit, as unsuitable to a courtroom appearance as full skirts would be during a sword fight. And Lithwick concluded that Kagan should resist the impulse to don anything that suggests she's either a woman doing a man's job or dashing off to a cotillion. For a woman, respecting tradition isn't an option when the tradition in question involves the exclusion of women. Kagan apparently agreed and wore a typical women's business suit as Solicitor General. Today, she's found a solution to the problem of traditional professional attire. As an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, she wears a unisex black robe.
Thank you so much for reading that passage. And you do go on to discuss, the conundrum that Sandra Day O'Connor and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg had when it came to adopting that black robe, and that there's, it may have been a baggy sacco cloth, but there still were gender implications. Could you talk a little bit about that and how it led to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's particular style flourishes?
Yes. So the black robe still has a kind of a V-shaped cutout that mirrors the cutout from a lapel on a suit coat. So in a sense, it's still masculine attire. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg pointed this out and said that she and Sandra Day O'Connor kind of got together and said, well, we should do something to make this more appropriate for a woman. And they came up with the solution of the lace collar that could be worn on the outside of the robe. And of course, now Ruth Bader Ginsburg became famous for her collection of lace collars, which were such a style statement that her clerks and various admirers would send her, people from around the world would send her these lace collars. Of course, she even wore different lace collars to signify different things, like a special one for a dissent, someone she was reading the majority opinion, and what have you. And interestingly enough, she wore her dissent collar on the day Donald Trump, who infamously insisted that women should dress like women, was elected president of the United States.
Certainly, there are always, court watchers who are also trying to be weather forecasters, and they always get excited or used to get excited when they saw Justice Ginsburg wearing her dissent collar.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit more about this gender divide and the difficulty that arises when what's considered professional also, equates to, well, what was the traditional masculine version, or what is traditional for women to wear and what are they expected to wear, because they are women. Your colleague, Deborah Rohde, who unfortunately passed very recently, wrote a book called The Beauty Bias, and you mentioned it several times in your book. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Deborah and I had some great conversations as I was in the course of writing this book, and her input was instrumental in helping me to see all of the double binds and the difficulties of feminine attire. She wrote quite powerfully about the dilemmas that women face in conforming to gendered norms of dress. There's really a catch-22 bind. On the one hand, women are expected to be decorative, and this is one of the things that Deborah wrote so powerfully about in The Beauty Bias. So there's a norm of feminine decorativeness that applies even as women enter into traditionally masculine occupations, where precisely that decorativeness is seen as, kind of discrediting. So there's a real catch-22. You need to wear nylons and high heels and makeup, but of course those are exactly the kind of things that men renounced when they entered the professions hundreds of years ago during the great masculine renunciation, and so they code immediately as unprofessional, as frivolous. So Deborah was great at zeroing in on those things, and the question of this catch-22 bind that women face is one of the big themes of a section of the book on gendered norms.
And also, you write quite powerfully about people who, choose not to dress in a way that matches whatever gender they were assigned at birth, whether that is because they themselves have a transgender identity or, they have other reasons to adopt that clothing. One of the more interesting examples you used was, and I may not pronounce this correctly, the chevalier dion.
Yes.
That's quite the story, and I would love for my listeners to just hear that. It's very powerful, and you write about it in the book, and it just goes straight to the heart when it comes to how fashion can be used to acquire power or to manipulate your social status in such an interesting way.
Yes. So the Chevalier Dion was his and her life was surrounded in a great deal of mystery. So the some of the historical records not clear, but what appears to have happened is that he was a agent in the basically the French Secret Service. And as part of his espionage and diplomacy, at one point wore women's clothing in order to either escape detection or to insinuate himself into the Russian court. It was that part's unclear, but he wore women's clothing. When he returned and later was stationed in London, there began to be speculation about whether the Chevalier Dion was in fact a woman. And it became so heated that in fact people were taking bets. London bookies were taking bets on whether or not the Chevalier Dion was male or female. Now, in the background, there's all sorts of controversy and intrigue around his relationship with the French government. There's the speculation is that he's now on the outs with the French government, and they've started this rumor to undermine him. At one point, he threatens to publish pamphlets of all of his secret correspondence with France and becomes a big celebrity in London. Gets very complicated, but ultimately he leaves London, according to some accounts, because he's run up so much debt that he needs to escape the creditors in order to avoid debtor's prison. Leaves London and makes a deal to return to France, but a condition of the deal is that he will have to live as a woman and wear women's clothing. So he adopts or accepts this and begins to live life as a woman. And so, at this point, I think it's appropriate to refer to the Chevalier Dion as she, lives life as a woman, finds it hard to fit into the constraints that are placed on women during this period in history. This is in the late 1700s, or mid 1700s. Finds it hard to live with the constraints that are placed on a woman at that time, wants to return to his military uniform and what have you, but nevertheless lives life as a woman and ultimately becomes a feminist of a sort. In part, one might argue because of the experiences she had, living life as a woman in women's clothing.
I love what she said, and I'm not going to get this quote exactly right, but you have it in the book, where she's like, I would rather outfit the dragoons and have to dress all these soldiers than acquire one outfit to wear during a day.
Yes.
For a woman of that time, there just were so many pieces to it that it was just such a hassle. So,
right.
Fascinating character in history, the Chevalier d'Eon. But to move from history to the present moment, as I was reading the book, which again for listeners is Dress Codes: How the Laws of Fashion Made History, as I was seeing all these different periods where there was a real cultural or seismic shift in what was worn or expected to be worn, I had to wonder what the pandemic is going to do to our clothing and expectations. I don't know about my listeners or you, but I would say for the first 3 or 4 months that I was exclusively working from home, not leaving except to go to the grocery store, it was real clown time when it came to my outfit choices. And we are, fingers crossed, within the next year, hopefully approaching a time where it will be safe for more people to emerge back into society, back into the workplace. But do you think we'll have changed our wardrobe expectations?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I expect there will be changes, but I don't think the focus on appropriate dress or dress codes will go away. Fashion is so important to the way people present themselves and understand their place in society that some version of that will continue to exist. it'll be very interesting to see what happens as some people are working remotely and others are going back into the office. But one thing, with respect to remote interactions, one interesting thing that's happened is that although there's less focus on clothing because you can't see anything other, it's a talking head. What replaces it? Well, it's Room Raider, where, what you look at what's behind the person in the room, and now people are being judged on the artwork or the furniture or what kind of wine is in the wine rack behind them and these sort of things. And there are a whole set of now rules and expectations that have started to develop around that. Like, you need to clean up your apartment before you go on a Zoom call. It's disrespectful. You need to, make sure that the things in the background send the message you want to send, kind of a dress code for your apartment. So when one way or another, we're always looking at these things.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was reading the book. I myself, from the very beginning of the pandemic, started using the artwork of an artist named Pam Wishbow for my Zoom rooms. So I have the green screen going on,
Uh-huh.
and I coordinate which Zoom room I am going to use with what's my outfit that day.
Ah.
But, I had stopped wearing jewelry. It wasn't something I thought about really, and I put on a necklace today because I'm speaking to you about about fashion, but I had stopped wearing jewelry, but there were still other things like, oh, picking the Zoom artwork, or, I've been making masks for the past
Hmm.
10 months on a sewing machine and coordinating the mask fabric to what I'm wearing, and I just feel more put together when my mask matches my outfit. And so even in these changing times, there's still that instinct to personalize or to either stand out or to match your own self image of yourself as a person out in the world and how you want to represent that. So I will be very interested to see what comes out of this. I've seen some speculation on Twitter and you actually talk in your book about flapper fashion and how seismic a change that was in women's fashion, yet it still led to certain restrictions. You may not be wearing a corset, but there may be another kind of undergarment you have to wear to fit into these fashions. And speaking as a woman and speaking to friends of mine who wear bras, the underwire, I just really wonder, is that going to recede? Are we going to see different kinds of garments because we got used to being in our houses for months and months and months? Anyway, so that's one of the things that I've been pondering as I read dress codes and what's next for us. Yeah, I don't know how you found your fashion being affected by the pandemic.
Well, like everyone, I shifted to more casual clothing. I mean, there's really no point. You feel a little silly putting on a suit or a sport coat when you're just sitting at home or you having all your meetings on Zoom. But then over time, I felt I want to get up and have a normal day as much as I can, even though I'm in the pandemic. And that includes putting on something that's, presentable, that's professional, that, fits with a normal day. So one of the things I noticed is that there's a whole new kind of genre of upgraded loungewear that's come onto the scene so that it's comfortable, it's just kind of made of knit or it's sweatpants, but they're a little more polished looking, they're a little more professional looking, and I wonder whether that's going to be one of the new things to come out of the pandemic, that you still want to look put together, and there's still a status aspect to it because just as there are with things like Allbirds shoes, people know that they're expensive even though they're casual shoes, that you're going to have that kind of thing with loungewear as well.
Yeah, that will be fascinating to see and to see if it actually makes its way into the courtroom, because it seems to me from, talking to lawyers I've known, my own mother was an attorney, and, pantyhose was a major part of her life that has not had to be part of mine. It does seem like the legal community, at least when it comes to appearing in court, you're going to be a couple decades behind when it comes to what's accessible.
Yes, because the judges, tend to be older and from a different generation, and their view of what communicates respect is different, but you have to care about what the judge thinks of your appearance. And certainly some judges even, chastise people in open court or issue rules about, the clothing, or say things to suggest, that's not appropriate for our courtroom. So you're always safer, putting on the suit or the nylons or the, more conservative, no one's going to complain about that. But if you go in the other direction, you're running a risk.
Very much so. And there's a darker side to that than, being chastised by the judge when you're an attorney, which is having your clothing choices end up sending you to prison or getting you sentence enhancements or making you the target of violence. And you certainly address that in your book as well. Could you talk a little bit about what you discovered researching the book when it came to issues like that, like sentence enhancements or an outfit that you're wearing being a pretext for a police stop, for example?
Yes. So there are in some American cities dress codes, rules that prohibit certain types of dress that are often associated with African Americans. So, for instance, sagging jeans or clothing that's understood to be, connected with a gang, but may also be clothing that's worn by, large groups of people who aren't involved in criminal activity in certain communities. I found that the wrong clothing could be and was used in some criminal prosecutions as evidence of membership in a gang that therefore would tie activity to other much more dangerous gang activity. So in one case, someone who defaced a mural, so it's graffiti, a relatively insignificant infraction, but because of what he was wearing, the prosecutor argued that he was the member of a gang who was in battle with another gang, and that defacing that mural was a provocation. It was similar to an assault. It was an act of war that then was responsible for a confrontation that led someone to die. And so they prosecuted this person for the murder because on the theory that the defacing the mural was the cause, and that someone in his position would know that this would lead to violence down the line. Now, all of this was contestable. In fact, it wasn't clear that this person was a member of the gang. He may have been wearing the clothing for some other reason. Very interesting story about how people testified in court as to the significance of his clothing and whether it did, in fact, demonstrate that he was a member of a gang. Ultimately, an expert witness pointed out other evidence that he had dressed in different colors at a different time, and even dressed his son up in clothing that would have signified membership in the opposing gang. And that was the evidence that was used to say, well, if he was really a member of this gang, there's no way he would dress his son in the colors of the other gang. And that's proof that actually that clothing didn't signify what the prosecutors said it did. But it's a real phenomenon that clothing can have that quite serious consequence.
I think that it's hard not to think about Trayvon Martin wearing a hoodie, which I personally have upwards of 6 hoodies in my own closet. But this young teen wearing a hoodie was considered a provocation and signed that he was a danger to the community, such that stand your ground laws should apply to his shooting. And that was one of the starker cases that, and you mentioned that in your book, of course, but
Yes.
it really is a thinker about how even the same clothing put on a different body with different societal expectations or perceptions can go from being innocuous to seen as, a danger. And that certainly is in no way comedic or lighthearted, but
No.
you do reference several cases throughout the ages, and I'm talking, back to the 1400s and the 1500s, that now come across that way to us, comedic, that, a man whose pantaloons were simply, far too shocking, and he was going to cause women to faint in the streets, so his pantaloons had to be seized from him and hung on the walls of the city of London or something of that sort. And those come across as so anachronistic to us. Or the straw hat, is that the straw hat riot? Am I getting that correct?
Yes, the straw hat riot, where if you wore a straw hat after I think it was September 15th, that was considered to be a great offense to good taste. And marauding gangs would come and knock the hats off of people and impale them on pikes, and apparently created a great riot throughout Manhattan. The reports suggested all the way from the Bowery up to Harlem, with people fighting either to retain their hats or to knock the hats off of passersby. It caused stopped traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge and all kinds of upheaval based simply on the affront of wearing a straw hat after September 15th.
Well, one thing I would love to get from you before we let you go, and thank you so much for joining us,
Thank you.
is, you mentioned that throughout the centuries there have always been manuals or written codes of, etiquette and behavior and fashion. And, I know my parents are both attorneys, and growing up, I know that on the bookshelves were, how to dress for success and
Yeah.
women's how to dress for success. And you're having to figure out what color family you fall in and all that. But I do wonder, are there current books that you would recommend for either young attorneys or even attorneys who are pretty far into their profession when it comes to how to adopt fashion that flatters you and makes you appear quote unquote professional, however the legal profession defines that?
Oh, that's a good question. So there are a few that come to mind. Alan Flusser has written two books. One's called Style and the Man, and it's a short book that gives good advice. Esquire magazine put out a book a while back called The Handbook of Style. And that's a good one, which isn't pushing people too fashion forward. It's more in the classic mode. And that's something for professionals that's important, but gives good advice about appropriate style. And then another one, which is a little bigger, more of a coffee table book. Again, Alan Flusser, Dressing the Man. So those are great for male attorneys. For women, the rules are more complicated, and so it's harder to come up with just that right manual. There are more options. The landmines are more prevalent. I know that many law schools, for instance, have set up, what not to wear type conferences, but it's always very tricky to get that balance right. And so I'm afraid I don't have the go-to sources there, both because I'm a man, but also I think it is just harder for women.
So, if my listeners were interested in picking up your book, Dress Codes: How the Laws of Fashion Made History, where could they do that? Where should they go?
So several places. Of course, your independent local bookstore is a great place, and many have websites where the book will be available. Bookshop.org is a good go-to source for books, which partners with independent bookstores. And of course, there's always Amazon as well, but it'll be available. It's available for pre-order now, and it publishes on February 9th.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. Again, for my listeners, this has been Richard Thompson Ford, author of Dress Codes: How the Laws of Fashion Made History. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this episode of the Modern Law Library. If you enjoyed it, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast listening service. And if you have a book in mind that you would love for me to cover on this podcast, go ahead and reach out to us at books@abajournal.com.